Thriving in today's fast-paced world of change and disruption requires innovation. Inside Outside Innovation is the podcast that explores the ins and outs of innovation with raw stories, real insights, and practical advice from the best and brightest in the world of startups and innovation. Each week, we'll bring you the latest ideas in lean startup, design thinking, corporate venture capital, and more. Now, let's get started.
Hi, and welcome back to the Inside Outside Innovation Podcast. This is Josh Berry, always along with my co-host Brian Ardinger. And as you know, we're focused on finding interviews here with the best and the brightest to bring you real stories and best practices in the areas of corporate innovation, corporate venture capital, entrepreneurship, accelerators, all the things that companies are doing nowadays to increase the likelihood that they'll find that next best product or the next business model. This week is no exception. We've got the innovation leader for American Pacific Mortgage with us, Mr. Kyle Nicholas McCray. American Pacific is one of the top 25 mortgage companies in the U.S. today and is poised to be one of the top 10 private mortgage companies in asset size. Kyle's going to share some of the things they've worked on in their accelerator, how amazingly they had an 8-figure win pretty much out of the gate, the importance of having executive buy-in and good flight coverage, how they've figured out how to integrate startups and other ideas back into the corporate structure, which I know a lot of people struggle with. And he'll even share a little bit about his passion for seeing corporations and startups continuing to work more and more together. So, hope you enjoy this great interview with Kyle from American Pacific Mortgage. So walk me through a day in the life. What does being innovations manager for American Pacific mean?
That is a great question. I wouldn't consider myself an expert by any means, and thus I try not to put a definition on innovation because I'm not sure a one size fits all fits. And so the way that I would define innovation is a combination of two things: risk and time. And as it pertains to American Pacific Mortgage, we're making investments in the future. They tend to be a little bit more risky. They tend to have longer timelines in terms of return on investments. And, a day in the life is understanding what opportunities are available to us that fit our business model, and interfacing with various executives from different departments to advance, a combination of what would be sustaining innovation or disruptive innovation.
Sure. Where do you spend the majority of your time? More on the sustaining incrementalism area, or more on the transformative, different products, different business models side of things?
It would lean more towards disruptive innovation. More of the investments that we're making for the future are things that the company has never done before.
Sure. So there's a lot of different flavors that people are taking towards that side of innovation, whether it's venture funds or internal accelerators or other maybe internal black ops teams that are just focused on attacking and killing the core business.
Right.
But what are some of the things that you're doing at American Pacific that are either working or you wish were working a little bit better? Good
question. I feel like if you were to put what we do in a box, you could call us a corporate accelerator or an innovation lab. But we certainly, every investment we make doesn't succeed. So there's a lot of, best practices that we can talk about today, but we can also equally talk about what doesn't work. I think what makes our program unique is how we've positioned innovation, how we are intending to innovate, and the level of oversight that we have. And I think this is why a lot of innovation programs fail, is the ability to have enough space to innovate, to experiment on things that may conflict with the traditional business, but still have the level of oversight and alignment with the executive team. And just on behalf of American Pacific, our innovation department directly reports to the chairman and founder of our organization. So we have.
Okay. So you've got a lot of coverage from above that helps shield you a little bit.
We do, and I cannot underestimate how important that is.
Okay.
That we are almost a $10 billion organization with multiple layers of management. And oftentimes, and not just in American Pacific, but all companies, corporations specifically, is if these types of investments do conflict with the core business, or if we're relying on managers that aren't incentivized to see these investments be successful, it can create conflict. And so without that highest level of oversight, you can have a tremendous amount of pressure or failure, or not just be able to develop an environment to see innovation be successful.
Yeah, I think you nailed it there, Kyle, that a lot of people, their compensation, their bonus, all of these things are tied to not taking big risks, right? And so having someone up at the CEO who is basically establishing the rules of the game for you is exceptionally helpful. Yeah, Kyle, you mentioned you could, if you had to put it in a box, it'd be like an accelerator. Is that working with external teams, or is it internal teams that you just happen to treat in more of a traditional accelerator focus? Walk me through, kind of at a high level at least, the mechanics of your program and maybe some of the successes.
Great question. We do both. And this goes back to what I mentioned earlier about trying not to put innovation necessarily in a box or define it specifically, because it means different things for different organizations. For American Pacific, it all depends on the opportunity. We have different investments that are mostly served by internal teams, as well as working with, and I think this is really important, I'd like to touch on this subject, is partnering with startups and a little bit more nimble organizations on the cutting edge that help us more quickly get to our end goals. And I would just like to say I'm really excited to see the success that you're having on with your company Econic, and the ability to bridge gaps between the startup world and the corporate world, because we live that space every day. Oftentimes in an internal environments, we don't have all the resources, all the tools immediately accessible to us. So in those specific instances, we do go out and find partners, a lot of them being startups that are developing the next innovations, the technologies, the tools and the tactics that we're aspiring to co-create.
Yeah. Well, again, let's dive into that a little bit more. And thank you for the compliment there about Econic.
Sure.
When I talk to a lot of corporations about partnering with startups, it always feels kind of a little Goldilocks-ish, and that they're like, well, if it's too early, it's really hard for us to work with them. And if it's too late, then we're overpaying for it. How do you find the just right spot? And what do some of the types of partnerships or types of collaboration end up looking like with some of these startups?
Really, really good points there. And again, it just depends. For a specific example of how we partnered with a startup, there was an instance where we created a service that became very successful. And we were able to, slowly, a year and a half into it, be able to create a sustainable business that is now thankfully generating 8 figures on a monthly basis.
What? That's crazy, Kyle.
Yeah, and I say that because, first and foremost, wasn't easy, and by being in the innovation department, we were prepared to, at all costs, outside of legal, moral issues, we were prepared to start over if the business needed to.
Yeah.
And the reason why I'm bringing that up is because we actually had to. And one of the issues with that particular service was transparency or visibility into what specifically we did to our partners and our customers. And oftentimes when you have innovation departments within corporations, you're competing against other departments and finite resources. And we didn't have the ability to develop something internally to offer that level of transparency. So we went out and found a company, Special Agent X is the name of the company. They developed a dashboard that brings visibility and transparency to the mortgage space.
Okay.
And we partnered with them to develop a dashboard that solved our problem. And really just recognizing that we didn't have the expertise, we didn't have the resources or the ability to turn that around as quickly as we needed to. So we went out and found someone that did.
That's a great success story. Thank you very much, Kyle. What's interesting to you right now in the area of innovation in the mortgage industry or fintech or even things around it? What's catching your eye that you're most excited about?
Well, and again, I'd like to go back to the work that you're doing with Econic, and this is one of the reasons why I was so excited to come on your podcast. Was the work that you're doing bridging the gap between startups and the corporate world. You know, as I mentioned earlier, I don't think that our investment would be as successful as it was or is today without that partnership and solving a problem that, you know, we ourselves could not. So I'm so excited about corporations and startups coming together. There's a lot of companies kind of in our space, but beyond, that are starting to investigate and try to understand how they can make that work, because, you know, corporations offer resources, they offer distribution channels, but there's a lot of great things that startups offer that corporations can't execute on. Speed, agility, you know, and I really am passionate about seeing both of those worlds being bridged and the opportunities that offers in the future.
Sure. You're also hitting around something that we also hear quite often, and that's if I do these partnership with startups or even more traditional M&A, I then have this whole issue of reintegration, right, back into the company, back into the core business. What have you learned in terms of really being able, or are you also in that same boat of trying to figure out how do we do successful reintegration, or do you keep them separate? I guess I'm making some big assumptions there. So just tell me about that. Do you dive into those reintegration issues?
Of course. And it all, again, goes back to our intentions. Is what are we intending to do with the innovation department as a whole, but also within the innovation department, the investments that we make and where we see them in the long run. And that's why I go back to the definition of innovation as time and risk. These are investments for the future. But if you're not intending to, or you're not strategizing on where you want to go, you don't understand that. And so when we're evaluating the opportunities that are in front of us, we look at, again, organizing them in the form of disruptive or sustaining innovation. And then based on the buckets that it falls under, we start to immediately align with, even if we are working, or, you know, even if we have the capacity or the space in the innovation department to do the work, we start to make those alignments with the different departments, because ultimately we don't want to end up in a place where we were intending to integrate this in. The purpose of this investment was not to be a standalone product or service. And at the end of the day, we are not prepared, or we haven't aligned ourselves or institutionalized ourselves enough to be able to hand that off. And just as an example, the investment that we spoke about earlier, one of our more successful investments, we've officially integrated that into our production department. Is we always intended for that product or service to be developed in a way that would be handed off and operate as a traditional piece of the business, which it is doing today. But we needed the time to innovate and develop and to make that successful before, we really handed that off. But not, to your point, not all investments fit that same model or mold.
That's good. But what I like and what I'm hearing, I think, is you're calling your shot before you even go into it, right? You're saying that the intent of this one, and maybe it'll shift over time, but this is the strategy that we want to have because it fits this type of innovation or it fits this into our culture. So you're flexible, but you're also being very intentional as you're going into each of the engagements or investments.
That's right. And you mentioned something very, very important, that it culturally and both from a business perspective, you have to have alignment even before you begin.
Yeah.
And without those pieces, inevitably, it's hard to be successful without that, especially, again, when you're inside of a large corporation.
Sure. Kyle, shifting gears a little bit, I'm curious about how organizationally your innovation group or business unit is structured. How many people do you have on the team? What types of roles? Or if you can't get into that, at least, how are they divided up? How does the team work?
Yeah, so, I manage the innovation department, but, from a structural standpoint, it's 100% fluid. And organic. When we're evaluating the opportunities, both disruptive and sustaining, we try to forecast what types of resources we would need for them to be successful. Mm-hmm. So, when it comes to the different initiatives that we're pursuing, and we try to keep that limited because we want to focus on the ones that we think will yield the greatest results. Despite if they, kind of transform as we're developing them, but we keep it very fluid and organic. And my role is to understand, when we are evaluating those investments or initiatives is what types of resources do we need to pull in? Do we need to go out and find those resources? Do we need to strategically partner with departments in the organization to make sure that they're successful? And it again just all goes back to those investments. As of right now, there's about 20 of us in the innovation department working on various projects, but that changes depending on what the projects are and the resources needed to see them be successful.
Interesting. So what I'm hearing is you're almost prizing fluidity and almost more of a generalist approach out of the gate, and then you go find the specialist or other resources either externally or internally as needed.
That's right.
If people want to learn more about what you're working on, Kyle, or what American Pacific Mortgage is working on, how can they learn out more? You
can check out our website. It's apmortgage.com. Through our website, you can start to understand some of the investments we're making in mobile and beyond. I'm always available. I'm pretty active on LinkedIn and Twitter. So
what's your Twitter handle?
Directly @_the disruptor.
How did you get something cool like that? That wasn't taken already?
It wasn't taken. And I won't even take credit for the name. I've been given that name, believe it or not, internally as the disruptor. Is my job is to disrupt the status quo, and I felt that was a fitting Twitter handle, and you'll find the conversations both there and on LinkedIn. You follow suit.
Awesome, Kyle. The Disruptor, really appreciate having you on Inside Outside Innovation. Thanks again.
Thank you for having me.
Well, that's it for another episode of Inside Outside Innovation. Special thanks to our guests for being on the show this week. Also, we'd love to hear from you, so please do reach out and talk to us on Twitter at the IO Podcast. Visit us online at insideoutside.io. And if you have 30 seconds, go over to iTunes, leave a review, and you can subscribe there as well. We'd love to hear from you, and until next time, go out and innovate.